When I started telling stories at the camps I was running, a lot of what I did in the beginning was just these kind of goofy, made up cliffhangers. Tune in again tomorrow to find out. And I had this character, the flying meatball, and his wonderful, marvelous Swiss Army knife, which has a blade that can solve any problem. And so it's like the camp bus is hanging over the cliff, and what will the flying meatball get there in time, that kind of thing. Just goofy things that I wouldn't even remember any detail of years later. But when I decided, and actually it was running into some of the young people who had been campers years later who did remember all that stuff, and so, do you remember? And I started thinking, what, these are kids that have trouble learning. What if you went into education and used really good stories? And so one of the things I did when I was formally teaching was use long, wonderful stories and do the same thing, tune in again next week. And I I part of the time I was in was when there was this really intense knee-jerk reaction to, I guess the dominance of a certain form of Christian theology, and there was this thing at least. Well, I'm sure this was everywhere. You cannot tell any kind of Bible story. I mean, you could do Native American stories or whatever, this, that, and but in fact, before I went to work for the schools, I was telling stories in schools, and they invited me to tell on the school radio station. And I told Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant. And I came back the next, the story, the little boy with holes in his hands and feet taught the giant to not be selfish and to share the garden with his children. And I came back the next week, and they had chopped the ending off the story. Because Oscar Wilde, that great fundamentalist Christian, but I mean, it was the imagery. I think the literary term is a type of Christ, and of course I was furious, and it led to making another story. But when I was doing Tune In Again Tomorrow stories in the schools, I told The King of the Golden River by John Ruskin, and The Selfish Garden, and many stories. But I love the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. It's a garden story, a social justice story, and I finally decided I'm going to tell that story. And if anybody makes issue about it, I'll just I'll deal with it. I made the character Joe, not Joseph, and I didn't say where it was from. I just started telling the story, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on in that story. It's kind of like the well, but anyway, one day, and this was maybe a third grade class, I was telling the part of the story. If people are familiar with it, there's a place where, he'd been thrown into prison in Egypt because his brothers were jealous of him and sold him to kind of like slave traders, and he ended up a servant, a slave in the house of Potiphar, one of the close to the head guy, the Pharaoh in Egypt. And in the actual story, Potiphar's wife wanted Joseph to sleep with him, and he refused. I can't, this is not right. I can't do this. And so she framed him. She, okay, you won't. So she told her husband that he had tried to go after her. Well, in telling the story to younger people, I just made it that the wife of the man that he was working for tried to get him to do something bad that was wrong, and he refused, and she got mad. And so, that was the way the story was done. Well, I get done with this one day, and this little girl comes up when the class is leaving. She said, "Larry, I can't be here next week." And I thought, oh, she's just wanted to make sure she found out what happened next. I said, you going on a trip? And she said, no, we have to move to my grandma's. My mommy did something naughty. She's going to jail. And I, oh man. And I said, we talked a bit about how hard that was, but then I used the refrain that I'd been using in the story. Whenever Joseph got in trouble, well, he was pretty smart, he was honest, and he was a hard worker. And I said, well, you're pretty smart, you're honest, and you're a hard worker. And she got this big smile on her face, like something from hearing the story could help her to go through these hard times. And of course, then as soon as I had a long enough break, I went to the school social worker and made sure that they knew that this was happening, which they didn't. And of course, that's the value of a story, is it often looses something that somebody might not otherwise talk about. But that's the way it was.